So, anyways, good morning and welcome. And so, my talk today, again, is the theme. We have these concurrent themes, and so my talk today is obviously related to species at risk. I'm not speaking that much about specific groups of species. There's a lot of other great talks coming up on turtles and birds and snakes, and so my talk is around habitat types. And the idea of where species at risk live, what type of habitats they need to carry out their life processes is part of the work that I do, and I find it really, really interesting. And luckily I'm working up in the Muskoka area, so I get a chance to do a lot of this type of work. So I'm going to cover off sort of Muskoka landscape, as I can't do it in full detail for the next 40 minutes or so, but touch on that, and then also about habitat types. So I do have a little sprinkling of some species at risk information as well in terms of specific species throughout my talk. Right here you've got branch Bartonia. You can just see this tiny little short plant. It's about 20 centimeters tall, maybe 15 centimeters tall, really, really hard to see. And you find it in fens, and it's a threatened species. It's one that is really actually uncommon and rare, and hard to find if you're doing searches for it. Okay, just sort of an outline on my presentation. Living in Muskoka, man, are we ever lucky. Well, I mean, I moved here 7 years ago, and I grew up in the sort of Horseshoe Valley area, and it's quite a nice landscape there, but Muskoka is beautiful. It's a great landscape, and I want to talk a bit about that and why, how it relates to species at risk. I want to talk a little bit about the history of our landscape. So when you're driving across the landscape in Muskoka, you've got lots of lakes and rock barrens and forests. And I want to do a bit of an overview of sort of the history of our landscape and how it came to be. Then I'll talk about habitat types, as I mentioned, and relate that to species at risk. Talk about forests and rock barrens and the wetlands and shorelines that are very much the theme of this section here today. And then this idea of habitat mosaics. When you go across the landscape and you compare our landscape in Muskoka to southern Ontario, it's quite different. And so there's this idea of habitat mosaics that I want to touch on, and relating that on to stewardship. Living in Muskoka is so great that even the National Geographic has a buzz about it. There was a media release last year from the National Geographic that was voted the best summer trip destination of 2011. So that's pretty cool. And it said, basically this is a quote from the website. The 2,500 square mile natural playground includes 8,699 miles of shoreline, countless waterfalls and lakes bordered by granite peaks, not peaks, but bridges. Provincial Park to the east, the Algonquin Provincial Park to the east, 30,000 miles, Georgian Bay National Park to the west. So why do people come here and why do they love it? It's a landscape. It's an amazing, beautiful landscape, and that's sort of been recognized in this award, I guess it was, from National Geographic. So I assume many of you, or most of you, are from landscape, or from Muskoka, permanent residents, or if you're cottagers coming up to the area. Where do you live in Muskoka? And this is from the Watershed Council, one of the reports, in terms of the types of sub-watersheds that we have in Muskoka. We have a lot of landscape features and diversity in Muskoka. We've got 20 sub-watersheds. We've got the Georgian Bay coast. From side one area to the next in Muskoka, it's quite diverse. Georgian Bay coast, the Seven River Corridor, with the Trans-Severn Waterway. If you get down to that area, the species of flora and fauna are quite different. There's geological and climatic reasons for that. Of course, the Algonquin Highlands in the northeast, you get higher elevation, you get more snow load in there. It's cooler and earlier in the fall. The large Muskoka lakes, the three Muskoka lakes, Lake Rosso, Lake Joe, Lake Muskoka. Numerous rivers and vast forest and natural cover that's scattered throughout farmland. So it's an amazing landscape. Compared to in contrast to Southern Ontario, if anyone's here from Southern Ontario, I'm going to beat up on Southern Ontario a little bit. I lived, as I mentioned, in Horseshoe Valley, and then did live down in Guelph and Richmond Hill area. And when you come down you're coming down Highway 400, and once you get past Port Severn and you get down into Simcoe County there, you're coming out of Highway 11, and you get down past into really a dramatic difference in the change in the landscape. And so just to sort of compare and contrast our landscapes a little bit, Southern Ontario, it's a very uniform landscape for the most part. And you get different areas where it's not so much so, but and that's, you know, years of settlement and agricultural purposes. A lot of the forests were cleared, and so you have more of a landscape of isolated natural features that are scattered around. You've got a lot more urban settlement. You have isolated features, large mosaic of farmland that's, of course, has its importance and its function in terms of agricultural use and food sources and that type of thing, but it's very much a negative image of what we have in Muskoka landscape. So we have more forest cover. We have lakes, the shorelines of our numerous lakes. You can see these are some air photos taken from Google Earth and Flash Earth. So here you can just see the contrast. So you have a lot of diversity, a lot of variability, and that relates very much to habitat types. I do this, I'm sure everyone's familiar with Google Earth and Flash Earth. As part of my work, we do a lot of landscape analysis, and even out of my own interest for canoeing and hiking and that type of thing, I'll often go out and just sit down on the laptop and sort of Google Earth and Flash Earth around, and I mean, it's like getting out topo maps, but when you do that in Muskoka, you see a lot of really neat, unique landscape features. So here, you know, we're seeing lots of forest-covered lakes intertwined with drainage systems and water courses, wetlands. Quite a contrasting landscape in very southern Ontario. So back to the question of where do you live in Muskoka. There's different categorizations for breaking down the landscape. The Ministry of Natural Resources has these categories called ecoregions and eco-districts. More generally, I sort of look at the Muskoka landscape in terms of three broad areas. And there's a lot related to past influences of glaciation, for example. If you look, here's Highway 400, and you look west of Highway 400. How many people live west of 400 or have a cottage out there? Anybody? Okay. So I mean, that landscape, there's a lot more rock barrens. There's still a lot of forest cover, a lot more rock barrens on the landscape. You get out to the coast, which is, you know, it's a fantastic landscape from views, and that's what attracts a lot of cottagers. So it's quite different from, let's say, east of Highway 11. You have deeper soils, you have a lot more forest cover, you have a lot less rock barren east of Highway 11. And then, who's east of Highway 11? Okay, I am as well. So, and then in between sort of Highway 11 and Highway 400, these are just general characterizations that I kind of come up with, is sort of the transition from a lot more rock barren communities or fewer rock barren communities transitioning to more forest cover. And that relates very much to sort of the past history of glaciation. So I just want to talk a bit about sort of the history of our landscape and sort of what shaped the Muskoka landscape. As I mentioned, this is very broadly within the context of the talk today. I mean, each one of these topics you could have a whole other talk. Glaciation, so basically continental glaciation that scoured the landscape, had a predominant or a huge influence obviously on our landscape many years ago, or thousands of years ago. Logging, sort of the initial settlement and logging of primary and secondary forests, and then obviously settlement, early settlement, and then more recent in the last 10, 50, and 60 years. So with glaciation, anyone have some familiarity with glaciation? And I see some nods. I mean, reading up on this, it's a bit dry, but it's interesting because it relates to reading the landscape, and part of the work that I do, that's sort of an important connection. What are the types of soils and how do they get there? So the most recent glaciation period was Wisconsin, 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. And if you can imagine, this area would have been covered by ice, kilometers, 1 or 2 kilometers in thickness in areas. And it would have effectively just been like a bulldozer, just scraping the landscape moving from the north to the south. Anything and everything on the landscape would have been removed, right down to Canadian shale, to the bedrock. And as those glaciers then retreated, there was massive amounts of meltwater and that deposited soil and boulder, and that sort of formed the basis of what the vegetation communities currently have. And then advance many, many years. I mean, as a biologist and ecologist, we think in terms of life cycle of an animal or seasons for vegetation communities in the fall. Working with other colleagues in the past and geologists, it's always interesting. 10,000 years is nothing. I mean, the time scale. So it's always interesting to look at time scales and how that has an influence on the landscape and on species as well. So obviously during logging periods, it would have come through and there would have been initial logging of primary forests, and white pine would have gone first, then yellow birch, hemlock for the need for tannins and that type of thing. And so those are sort of the initial components of human alteration to our landscape. And following that, you would have had these massive fires on the landscape, some of them naturally occurring and some of them through that would have been set, intentionally set. So you're coming through and there's a lot of logging occurring. You have slash piles, and so these fires would have been really intense. And as recent as 60 years in certain areas, would have had really intensive fires. But going further back to that, these intensive fires would have changed the landscape a lot too in terms of the soil composition, species composition as well. And then more recently, obviously, early settlement and more recent settlement. So these are influences on our landscape. Original settlers coming in and logging and creating farmland in the few areas where we have soils that are deep enough to allow for farming. And of course, establishment of urban areas. We've got our town of Huntsville, Bracebridge, and cottage development, Shorelines. And so those are obviously all components that had effects on our landscape. So here's our bulldozer. If you can imagine thick ice. Muskoka's in around here. So this is about 12,000 years ago. So this is basically coming down, scraping everything clear, and that's our ground zero, if you will. Our vegetation is completely removed. And then the retreat of the glaciation, we had a whole series of different lakes that formed. We had something that, an ancient glacial lake called Lake Algonquin would have covered much of Muskoka at that time. And here you have the ice sheet is retreating, you have lots of water. This is the current basin, Georgian Bay Basin, or Great Lakes Basin. And then you have Lake Simcoe and Muskoka up in here. So Lake Algonquin would have inundated, obviously, the shorelines in Georgian Bay all the way up to Highway 11. And in fact, Highway 11 is in large part an area where there would have been the shoreline, more sand deposits, and that's where you find a lot of sand pits, sand and gravel pits. And it was actually, when they're building Highway 11, it's an ideal spot to build it rather than all over the rock ridges. You've got this natural sand deposit from the glacial Lake Algonquin that goes north south, great spot to put a road. So there's those types of connections to our landscape. At that time too, the pulses of meltwater would have been huge, and the Great Lakes Basin would have been very much different, obviously, than it is now. For example, the French River at one point would have been flowing to the east compared to how it is currently. And there was a major outlet down through the Kirkfield outlet, which goes down through Carden Plain, and those massive glacial meltwaters have resulted in the Carden Plain. The Carden Plain area, if you're a birder, you probably are. So that glaciation and the retreat of glaciers had a big effect on the landscape. And there's evidence of glaciation all around. That's in part, the interesting components of our landscape, and also relating it back to habitat types and species at risk. You have these erratics, so these large boulders are just dropped off as the glaciers were retreating and melting and dropping all the material that was caught up in the ice. So you'll be hiking through a forest and you come across this massive rock that's an erratic from glaciers. Scouring, obviously. And again, if you look on Flash Earth and Google Earth, you can see these patterns in our landscape, and it's pretty amazing. And it relates very much to rock barrens and our distribution of species at risk and vegetation communities and so on. Okay, just generally with the early logging and fires, just sort of go over this one more time. As I mentioned, the removal of different species of trees. Currently now we have, from what I've read, a lot less hemlock in our landscape as well. So at the time, the need for hemlock tree removal for tannin took a lot of that off the landscape. So I mean, there's still a lot of hemlock components in the forest, but not as much as there would have been in the past. Obviously, old growth, there's fewer old growth components. We still do have some in areas that would have been inaccessible during the intensive logging years. It's amazing, actually, in some of the swamp communities that we have, where you get out into these areas, the tree cover, you know, you're not looking for, when you think of an old growth forest, you think of massive trees. But a lot of the swamps, you get trees that are fair size, but they're not actually as large as you think for an old growth. But if you age them, they're over 120, 150 years old because they're growing in the swamp, which is a pretty harsh place to grow for a tree. So again, these intensive fires that would have burned, I was speaking with someone at the Muskoka Heritage Trust, a gentleman there was telling me about. He's a forester that worked through the 50s and 60s about this area known as the Blueberry Barrens. So you think about Torrance Barrens, and again, if you go on Google Earth, you can look at that area, how much rock barren cover there is there. And he said, I mean, that area would have had a lot more soil and blueberry cover, and it was often known as the Blueberry Barrens, where they would have been harvested. And these fires burned so intensely in the shallow soils that would have been on the rock barrens, the organic material that would have built up over the centuries after glaciation would have been burned off in that heat, and just remaining sand, and that would have been blown off and washed off. So, in fact, the amount of rock barren cover we have now is a lot more than, let's say, 150 or 200 years ago. So that was been a big influence on landscape in those areas. Here's some fires. I think maybe like 2005 or 6 we had a good drought. And anyone get out to the Torrance Barrens? Yeah, it's just off of Highway 169. Really, really interesting area to go to. But there was quite a heat wave. I think it was back in 2005, 2006. Some of the barrens burned a bit too. So here you have an area, a burned barren, and has a profound effect on that vegetation. So of course, advancing, you know, we live on our landscape. We're going to have an influence on our landscape. That's a given. And you know, the influences that people have had on the landscape in Southern Ontario is obviously much more profound than it is here in Muskoka, but it's still evident, of course. We have our major highways, twinning of highways, Highway 400 and Highway 11, for expansion of development. You know, obviously across the landscape, if you're in the sky in an airplane, you can see these influences on the landscape. For movement of species, it's a barrier. Cottage development, shoreline development is obviously can have impact related to water quality and it affects the communities, shoreline, wetland communities, and that type of thing. And then of course farmland. So compared to Southern Ontario, there's not as much farmland, but in areas where we have good soil deposition, you do have farmland. And that's part of, you know, the mosaic of our habitat. So this idea of habitat types, it's really, a lot of the work that I do relates to characterizing forest communities and wetlands, and you know, there's all types of habitat types. You know, forests, swamps, marshes, fens, and bogs, shallow water, shorelines, and rock barrens. And I've touched on a lot of those so far. But these are obviously all the areas where we have our species at risk. And because of the diversity of the types of habitat types we have quite a range of species at risk. So when you think of forests, you know, there's always mixed forests that have components of deciduous and coniferous trees. Maple, sugar maples obviously dominant our landscape. Oak and pine associations. If you get out to Georgian Bay, there's a lot more oak pine associations, including red oak and white oak. And younger regenerating forests have aspen, birch, and ash. Swamps, I'm going to touch on some of the different types of swamps as well. When you think of a swamp, I don't know, most people envision lots of trees, but there's a range of different types. And they, mixed swamps, and as well as thicket swamps. So alder thickets and willow thickets, and so there's quite a wide range of different swamp types in Muskoka, and whether they're flooded, how long they're flooded, determines the type of vegetation that you find there. Marshes. Marshes are a key component in uptake of nutrients and spawning for different fish species early in the season. Nesting for marsh birds. A wide, huge range of marsh types. And now with the Great Lakes in the last 10 years having dropped so much, the expanse of marshlands and coastal marshlands, coastal marshes up the Georgian Bay is really expanded. And I'll show a few examples of those. So typically sedges and a type of grass, rushes, cattails are dominant in these types of habitats. And then fens or bogs. Fens and bogs are wetlands that are much less common in southern Ontario. They're basically very acidic communities, and they don't have a lot of nutrients in them. And with bogs, they have a lot of organic peat accumulation. So if you're doing your gardening and you have peat, that basically comes from the bog. They have a lot of unique characters that are basically attract a lot of different types of species, including a lot of reptiles, little microfeatures, hummocky areas, depths of the soil, that type of thing. Shallow waters and shorelines. So shallow shorelines that have bulrushes and floating vegetation you can find on lakes, but also you have areas that are ponds that are surrounded by rock barrens and forest cover, where it's basically kind of like a lake, but the water depth is such that you have a lot of this submergent vegetation. And then, of course, the rock barren types I talked about. So forest types. This is out near west of Highway 11, and just an example of some of the oak and pine mixed forest communities that we have along the coast of Georgian Bay. Composition of these species will change. I mean, around lakes, if you look at the air photos, the extent of cedar or balsam fir and hemlock will vary around shorelines. If you have a north-facing slope, you have a lot more hemlock. And again, this creates a lot of different diversity across the landscape. In a lot of areas with rock barrens and shallow soil, you have forest covered with natural openings and semi-open areas, which create good habitat for whippoorwill species. And then butternut is a species that, as part of our work, we have to deal with a fair bit in southern Ontario. And it's an endangered species, and it's found more often in southern Ontario, but also does occur in the southern end of the shield in deciduous forests. So some of the other species of risk you can find, cerulean warbler is this interesting looking bluebird, and it's not that widespread through Muskoka, but it's more on the southern end of Muskoka, and it's found in much more mature and even old growth forests. And it'll nest in some super canopy large trees. And obviously logging of those trees can have an influence on that species. And it's just been recently upgraded from special concern to threatened species. Also in forest, when you talk about habitat types, you think about sort of the large habitat of a marsh or a forest community. But even within those communities, you have a lot of microhabitats and little features that provide a lot of important function for wildlife. This is something called a little vernal pool. So if you're this time of year, hiking around, you'll find small ephemeral or vernal pools, and they're basically areas of standing water that have collected from the spring runoff and spring water that dry up around July. And they're small, like this one is maybe 20 meters by 10 meters. But starting from sort of April through till June, there's a lot that goes on in these vernal pools. You start off with salamanders coming in very early on when there's still snow and even ice in these vernal pools coming to breed. This is actually an egg mass of first blue-spotted turtles, blue-spotted turtle, or sorry, blue-spotted salamander. So these egg masses are laid on a lot of the vegetation around the edges of the vernal pools, and they can be, again, the size of this, half the size of this room here. And so basically in May you can go out and see a lot of these features that are there, and they provide an important function to the landscape, but they're not very large, so they're very productive. In some areas you can have, this is a tree frog, gray tree frog, you can have 2, 3, or 4 species of amphibians that actually utilize this area. And by July, for breeding, and by sort of mid to late June or early July, it's dried up, and all those species have reached a stage where they can leave the vernal pool. So swamps. I mean, generally dominated by shrubs and trees. These areas can be flooded seasonally or not flooded at all, and so they change very much over the period of the seasons. In the summer, you may go into an area that appears to be a swamp, or appears to be just a forest, and it's actually a swamp because it's dried out. So it's very important to go out earlier in the season to identify swamp communities and some of the different types of, as I mentioned with the old growth. I was in one area where it was very small hemlock components, and we did core some trees, and we found that the hemlock was around 130 years old. And they weren't that large, they were maybe that large, and the one hemlock was up sort of on a hummock, and it was maybe that large, and it was about 120 years old. There was another hemlock that was a little bit lower on the hummock, and it so would have been in a condition of standing water for a longer period of time. It was maybe half the size and only 10 years younger. So it shows the variability in sort of how productivity from those trees. Blanding's turtles, and I'm sure Linda and others will be speaking about those, but they utilize swamps oftentimes if they're flooded and become a beaver pond. They utilize those for habitat, and often for moving as a corridor area, it's for moving from marshlands to the nesting habitats. And Massasaugas will typically hibernate in certain types of swamps, those that have really deep organic soils. So you can get into these swamps that have really deep organic soils and still large trees in them. And the tree roots that go way down into the organic soils, the Massasauga will actually go down to there to hibernate through the winter to get below the frost level to stay above the groundwater. Just in the changes of these habitat types, this is a swamp. We did a canoe trip out the Gibson River, and where the Gibson River comes into Gibson Lake, you got a huge, in the spring, a lot of water that comes in, and the water level in this riparian swamp is probably about 10 feet above the ground, maybe 6 or 10 feet above the ground. So you can paddle it among those, and so it just shows the dynamics of a lot of those communities based on seasonality and water flow. This is a swamp community. It looks like a marsh, but it's actually a leatherleaf. So it is a swamp type. It's just basically covered by shrub cover. Here's a range of marshes. If you get down to the coast of Georgian Bay, you see quite a wide diversity of marshland. And depending on how long the water is there, if it dries up, you'll have different species composition and different use of those habitat types by species risk and other wildlife. They're typically the most productive wetland on the landscape, high nutrients. Blandings are typically found in those, and also beaver ponds, and skip that one. Leaf bittern is marshland bird that is found in larger marsh habitats, so typically more along the coast. The species is threatened. Fens and bogs, I'll just touch on this quickly. As I mentioned, these are peatlands with deep organic soils. And, you know, within the habitat types, as I was mentioning, you get these micro-habitats. So you get little hummocks, such as these hummocks in here. And there's a lot going on at that very localized level in terms of species that you find there, but also for habitat for certain species, such as spotted turtles that are known to hibernate in these areas, burrow down. Ribbon snakes are often found in fens and in bogs, and Mosaics rattlesnakes also forage along the edges of fens and within them as well, and are found typically in fens and bogs throughout the summer. There's the fen, and fens are quite unique compared to marshland. You have a very specific suite of species that you find in there for plants as well as wildlife. You get this cotton grass, and you go out in July, and it's a species that occurs in 1 minute in high nutrient conditions. You get a lot of deer flies. There were about 30 on my colleague's hat there.
Does it work? Do you want me to?
Yeah, that'd be good. So shallow waters and shorelines, as I mentioned, these are often areas along shorelines of lakes, but also in these internal wetlands that you find often west of Highway 400, and they have open water or submergent vegetation, and again you find quite a range of species of risk in these habitats. Some shoreline. So rock barrens, very quickly. Rock barrens are really unique to Muskoka, and it's sort of the largest rock barren ecosystem in the Great Lakes Basin. And you can have treed rock barrens, open rock barrens, and you get these microfeatures on the barrens, such as these table rocks. Those are important features on a rock barren that species of risk will utilize, such as the Mosaics rattlesnake. They'll use this as a gestation site for thermal regulation. These are areas, again, you have lots of shrub cover and small rocks. You find skinks and milk snakes in those areas. So just the last few slides are around this idea of the habitat diversity. And at the site level, you have a lot of habitat diversity as well. So actually, let's go to the last one there, and then I guess talk about that. So again, when you look at the landscape, a lot of those different vegetation communities and habitat types that I described are mixed in sort of like a collage and a mosaic on our landscape. And that's a key component of the diversity of species that we have. We've got a lot of the fen communities, these rock barren areas, forested areas that are closed canopy and open gaps with rock barrens, where you have habitat for whippoorwill. So it's that sort of mix of habitat types that really is unique to Muskoka and promotes the fact that we have such a species of risk mecca.
Going to say Dirk?
The last slide was the end.
Yeah. You know, several times for swamps, marshes, and shorelines, 2 meters of water came up as a defining feature. Is there something magic about 2 meters of water?
Yeah, typically as you get water levels over 2 meters, then for submergent vegetation, you just don't get the light penetration for the vegetation. And then for tree communities, it's just you have the tree would die back. So it's becomes basically oxygen for our environment, so the trees die. So it's a seasonal fluctuation. So lots of water in certain times of the year, but then it has to dry down for the vegetation to be able to persist.
At the back there?
But counterintuitive that these peat soils are so low in nutrients. I've tried to plant trees in areas that I thought was rich soil, and they don't do well.
You tried? Well, yeah. I mean, it's like for a bog or a fen, the inputs of nutrient is into those types of wetlands is very low.
Joe Pyeweed does well. But
yeah, have you tried? But I mean, once the peat's taken out and used, I don't know if you're using this in the gardening context, it's mixed with soil, then those are the nutrient components that come into it. But for a bog, like a true bog is an area that has really around 9 species or 12 species in it. So there's so few species that are adapted to those conditions.
You have to be very selective.
Very selective, and it's very nutrient poor.
Awesome. There was a question here.
How long can white pine take being submerged before before we start having problems? Like we've got a beaver pond, and it's
Right.
this winter or this spring at least, we have a group of pines along the edge which have been submerged for weeks, and I'm just concerned about how many weeks they can
They're
tolerate
pretty
before.
resilient. I mean, if it's still standing water into July,
Yeah.
then you can, like June or July, you start to see some effects. But, and even certain species, if they're inundated or have standing water around them for well into August for a couple successive years, they're even tolerant of that ash. But because white pine, you think of it typically as an upland tree. You do find it in wetlands as well. So there's an element of tolerance there. Don't go taking the beaver dam out yet.
No, never going to happen.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Under beds and bogs, you said about ericaceous, is it shrubs? What are those?
Sorry, yeah, this is like heath in the heath family. So like Labrador tea, leatherleaf. So these are species that they basically, the leaves are a lot thicker, and a lot of times the leaves will stay on. Well, typically they stay on through the winter too. So they're evergreen in a sense, and they're tolerant of those nutrient-poor wetlands.
They don't waste any energy.
They don't
Losing them.
hang on to them. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, Anna, move it back.
Dirk, I really liked your conclusion and emphasis on the mosaic, the habitat mosaic, and I'm giving a talk this afternoon on snake and skink, and that was my conclusion as well, is it's the mosaic
It's
that's
the mosaic.
important, so it's independently came up with that, and it's very, very true. It's not,
Very true.
they don't just use rock farms, they don't just use wetlands, they're not just in the forest. Up here, they use all of them.
Yes,
It's
exactly.
the most important piece of the landscape to understand.
Yeah, and thanks, because I remember the last slide. just around, I mean, to tie it back, sort of, just around risks to these habitat types and sort of the stewardship component. I mean, we don't want to go in the direction of Southern Ontario, and largely we're not going to because, the disturbance of landscape is driven by agriculture. But, we have a lot of habitat, but we still have to recognize that, it has to be protected, and there's risks out there in terms of development for I work in the development industry, and we have lots of development clients. And, it's recognized there's going to be expansion in these areas, but I think, protection of sort of landscape units of large mosaics, and even at the site level, if you have a property that has a bit of all those things, wetland, rock barren, and trees, forest cover, those are sort of the areas you want to protect because it fits into feeding or filling the requirements of a range of species. So, and then Provincial Species at Risk Act, which is kind of the segue into Jan's stuff, which, I mean, it's, in my line of work, it's had a big effect in terms of what we have to address. And so there's lots of policy there, and but the real emphasis too is stewardship and awareness and education about this. So that's a balance between, the stronger regulation that I think people are trying to strike that balance. So, but thanks, Rob. Yeah, it's neat that we came to that same kind of.
So we can have one more quick question right there. Ruth? Yeah, thank
I
you.
was just wondering how, with risk to habitat, how vulnerable are we going to be to the invasion of these species like the pine borer, ash borer, all the ones that seem to be moving up?
There's a risk, I mean, between sort of terrestrial invasive species and aquatic invasive species. I mean, there's sort of two things there, but for things like the emerald ash borer, yeah, it's a big risk. I mean, they try to do a fire line or a break down in Windsor area, and it's a small little green bug beetle that attacks ash trees, red ash, green ash, and black ash. And on our landscape, those are really key species to succession. Black ash in wetlands, green ash in regenerating areas. So yeah, it can have a profound effect if it really gets to the stage of mass loss of those species. In Southern Ontario, there's a lot of some invasive species like buckthorn, and ash is in those regenerating areas. And if we lose ash, because we don't have a lot of maple or elm left because of the Dutch elm disease, then all of those non-native species will get a better foothold, so it's a concern for sure.
Okay, well, thank you very much.